a book that really gets to the heart of how we're influenced. Propaganda by Edward Bernays, published all the way back in 1928.
1928, yep.
We're going to try to get into Bernays' head a little bit, see how he viewed propaganda in a democratic society back then, what forces he saw shaping things, and look at some of the ways he observed it actually being used.
Yeah.
All drawing straight from the text, of course.
Right. And it's important, I think, to keep in mind that we're going back to 1928, To understand Bernays' perspective, we have to sort of put aside our current understanding of the word propaganda and really try to uncover the specific arguments he was making in the context of the world he was observing.
It's almost like a time capsule, a chance to peek into how one of these early figures in public relations viewed this, well, powerful tool of influence, right?
Yeah.
Shaping public thought. Okay, so Bernays doesn't waste any time. Right out of the gate, he makes this pretty strong statement, arguing that the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is, well, a vital part of a democratic society.
Yeah, it's a pretty bold claim to lead with, right?
It is. No mincing words there.
And he goes on to say that a lot of what we think, our opinions, our tastes, even like the ideas that pop into our heads, are largely shaped by people we don't even know exist. He calls this the invisible government, and he suggests it's not like some shadowy conspiracy, but more like a natural outcome of how a complex society, a democratic society, organizes itself, to function.
Invisible government. So it's not some secret cabal pulling strings.
No, not in the way we might usually think of it. What's so interesting here is that Bernays frames it as almost necessary. He's saying that in a society like ours, with so many different groups, so many moving parts, you inevitably end up with a relatively small number of people who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses, and they end up wielding a lot of influence over public opinion.
They become the influencers of their day, in a way, shaping public thought.
Exactly. The guides, almost.
So if this invisible government, in his words, didn't exist, what did he think would happen?
Well, he believed that without this kind of direction, if you will, individual choices, left entirely to their own devices, would just lead to chaos. Imagine a society where everyone just acted purely on impulse, with no external forces shaping desires, offering some kind of direction.
A lot of competing impulses.
Exactly. So he argues that propaganda, as he defines it, becomes this continuous, essential effort, really, to bring some order to public thought, to try to create some sort of shared understanding, some agreement.
Right, because you've got all these different impulses flying around.
Exactly.
But he also talks about how diverse this influence is, how it reaches such a wide range of people.
Oh, absolutely. He emphasizes the sheer variety of what he calls cleavages in society. Think about all the different ways people identify themselves and are identified by others. Their social circles, their political leanings, their economic status, their background, their beliefs, you name it.
Right. So many different categories.
And propaganda, in his view, is the tool that addresses these diverse groups. It tailors messages to resonate with specific interests and values.
So it's about understanding those different segments of the population and then crafting messages that speak to them.
Precisely.
To really drive that point home, he offers some really vivid examples from the 1920s, right? To kind of illustrate this complex landscape of public opinion.
Yeah. In the chapter Organizing Chaos, he paints this picture of this incredibly intricate web of organizations and publications that existed even back then.
Wow.
He mentions groups like the League to Abolish Capital Punishment, and of course you had countless trade journals catering to all these niche industries.
I can imagine.
Religious publications representing various faiths, professional associations for every field you can think of. He even notes that there were over 22,000 periodicals listed in one directory.
22,000 periodicals. That's a lot of voices.
Exactly. And it really highlights the challenge of reaching and influencing a public that's spread across so many different interests and affiliations.
So that kind of lays the groundwork for why Bernays thought propaganda, as he understood it, was so vital in a modern society.
Right.
Now let's dig into how he actually defined propaganda, particularly what he called the new propaganda. How is it different from the way the word was used previously?
This is where things get really fascinating. Bernays argues that propaganda had undergone a major transformation. It had become more sophisticated, more technically driven, and crucially, it was now relying heavily on insights into the psychology of the masses.
So it was becoming more scientific.
In a way, yes. It wasn't just about shouting slogans anymore. It was about understanding how people's minds worked.
I'm also struck by the fact that He really tried to redefine the word propaganda itself.
Oh, absolutely. He knew that it carried a lot of negative baggage even back in the 1920s.
Wasn't a very positive word, right?
Not at all. So to address this, he actually includes definitions from Funk and Wagnall's dictionary in his book.
He really wanted to set the record straight.
He did, and he points out that propaganda had also been used to describe, say, organizations dedicated to religious missions, or systems for spreading specific doctrines, or organized efforts to rally public support for a cause, or even the core principles advocated by a movement. He was trying to broaden people's understanding of the term, maybe even neutralize some of those negative connotations.
So to him, it wasn't inherently bad.
Right. It was more about the intention behind it and the methods used.
And he makes this strong case that this new propaganda, as he called it, was all around us, even in places where we might not recognize it.
Oh, yeah. He argued that it had become this pervasive influence, shaping opinions in subtle ways, even in what appeared to be objective news reports.
News reports.
Really? He uses the example of headlines in the New York Times, suggesting that even the way a news story is framed can subtly influence how the public perceives an event.
So the way information is presented matters just as much as the information itself.
Exactly. It's about framing, about emphasis, about creating a certain impression.
And he has this really great example of the velvet fashion revival, right, to illustrate this point.
That's a classic Bernays example. So he describes how these velvet manufacturers, instead of just directly advertising to consumers, they worked behind the scenes, cultivating relationships with influential figures in Parisian fashion circles, American fashion publications, those tastemakers.
The influencers of their time.
Exactly. And by getting these people to embrace velvet, they essentially created this desire for it among the wider public.
It's brilliant, really.
It is. And it shows the shift from direct persuasion to this more subtle manipulation of social trends and desires.
So it's not about convincing individuals one by one anymore, but about influencing these larger social and economic currents.
Precisely. Bernays believed that modern propaganda aimed to tap into and shape these larger trends, understanding that individual behaviors are often influenced by these wider forces.
It's about setting the stage, rather than dictating the individual actions.
Exactly.
Now that leads us to the individuals who are actually wielding this new propaganda. Who were they, according to Bernays?
Well, he called them the new propagandists.
The new propagandists, okay.
And he saw them as a kind of expert, someone who possessed the skills and knowledge to strategically create and shape public opinion.
So they weren't just mindlessly promoting things.
No, there was a level of understanding, of deliberate strategy involved.
He gives quite a long list of the kinds of people who fit this description.
He does. He identifies all sorts of figures in positions of power and influence. Presidents, cabinet members, senators, governors, prominent business leaders, labor leaders, editors of newspapers and magazines, religious leaders, educators. The list goes on.
Wow, so really anyone with a platform and the ability to influence others.
Essentially, yes. Those were the visible figures who often became the public faces and voices of these propaganda efforts.
But then he also talks about these invisible wire pullers working behind the scenes. Who were they?
Ah, yes. Those were the individuals who were advising and influencing those visible leaders. They might not have been famous themselves, but they understood how to sway public opinion and often guided the actions and statements of those in the spotlight.
It's like a puppet master situation.
In a way, yes. He has this great example of London fashion setting the trends for men's suits in America, and it all comes back to this one nameless, expert tailor.
So an anonymous influencer shaping tastes across the Atlantic.
Exactly. It illustrates this idea that there are these unseen forces at play, influencing our choices in ways we might not even be aware of.
It's interesting how often he uses fashion as an example. He even talks about how the length of women's skirts could be intentionally influenced.
Oh, absolutely. He argues that even seemingly trivial aspects of fashion could be deliberately manipulated to serve the economic interests of the clothing industry. It really highlights his point that many of the choices we think are personal are actually subject to these less visible forces.
Right, those invisible governors at work again.
Exactly.
And the figure of the Public Relations Council really emerges as a central player in this whole system, right?
Definitely. In Bernays' view, the Public Relations Council was the ultimate modern propagandist. Their role was more than just getting good press. It was about understanding the public mind advising businesses and other organizations on how to align themselves with what the public wanted, and then interpreting those organizations' goals to the public in a way that would resonate and build understanding.
So they were like translators, in a way,
Mm,
bridging the gap between organizations and the public.
that's a great way to put it. They were the masters of perception management.
He even talks about the ethical standards for these public relations councils.
He does. He emphasizes the importance of really understanding the public mind and the need for these counselors to be informed intermediaries. He talks about their function being to uncover unsuspected relationships between an organization and the public, ensuring that the organization really understands what the public wants, and that the public, in turn, understands what the organization is trying to achieve.
It's a delicate balancing act.
It is.
Let's dive a little deeper into the psychological side of things. Bernays was clearly fascinated by what he called the psychology of public relations. What were some of the core ideas he explored there?
One of the most fundamental ideas for Bernays was this concept of the group mind. He argued that when individuals come together in a group, their collective psychology isn't just the sum of their individual thoughts and feelings. It takes on a life of its own, you could say.
So it's like the group develops its own personality.
In a way, yes. And this group mind, he argued, is often driven more by emotions and impulses than by rational thought.
So appealing to emotions becomes really important.
Absolutely. And he believed that groups tend to look to and follow the lead of a trusted figure.
So leadership plays a big role.
Huge. And Bernays suggests that effective leadership in this context often relies on presenting ideas in simple terms, using easily understood cliches rather than complex reasoning.
He has that interesting example of the evacuation hospital, right?
Yes. That's a perfect illustration of how framing and the use of readily accepted ideas can shape group perceptions. Just changing the name of the hospital from evacuation hospital to something more positive drastically changed how the public viewed it, even though the function remained the same.
It's all about perception.
Exactly.
And Bernays, being a man of his time, was also influenced by the ideas of Freud, right?
Very much so. He incorporated this Freudian concept that many of our conscious thoughts and actions are actually compensatory substitutes for suppressed desires.
So our subconscious motivations are driving our actions.
To a large extent, he believed that was the case. And understanding these underlying, often unconscious motives became crucial for the propagandist. You couldn't just appeal to surface-level desires. You had to tap into these deeper drives.
He also drew this distinction between what he called the old and new approaches to propaganda, based on their understanding of psychology. What was the difference there?
The old propagandist, in Bernays' view, operated on a more basic understanding of psychology. They focused on simple repetition of slogans, expecting a kind of mechanistic reaction. But the new propagandist, they delved deeper into the complexities of group psychology. They understood the nuances of influence, the interplay of different factors, even on something as basic as eating habits.
He has that great example of doctors being used to promote bacon, right?
Exactly, leveraging the authority of a trusted group to influence behavior. And it was a shift from trying to directly overcome resistance to creating circumstances that would actually foster desire for the product or idea.
He talks about the piano example, too, where endorsements from famous artists made pianos seem more desirable.
That's another great example. It's about creating an environment where people want the thing rather than trying to force them to want it.
Subtlety and indirection.
Exactly. And the Procter & Gamble soap sculpture contest is another brilliant example of this. They tapped into all sorts of psychological motivations, the desire for beauty, competition, even maternal instincts to promote ivory soap.
Very clever.
Indeed. So Bernays is really laying out this whole new way of thinking about influence.
He is. It's not just about brute force anymore. It's about understanding the human mind and using that understanding to shape perceptions and behavior.
Let's shift gears a bit now and talk about how Bernays saw the relationship between business and the public evolving. What were some of his key observations there?
Bernays argued that the relationship between business and the public had undergone a major transformation. Businesses were realizing that their success depended not only on the quality of their products, but also on gaining the understanding and acceptance of the public.
So it wasn't enough to just make a good product anymore. Right. They had to manage their public image, build trust, align themselves with what the public valued. He uses examples like oil companies emphasizing their commitment to fair labor practices or bakeries highlighting their hygiene standards.
It's about showing the public that you're on their side.
Exactly. And the Public Relations Council became crucial in helping businesses navigate this new landscape. They were the ones who could advise businesses on how to respond to public demands and also help the public understand what the business was trying to achieve.
So they were kind of like diplomats, in a way.
That's a good analogy. They were bridging the gap between the two sides.
And Bernays talks about this concept of continuous interpretation,
Yeah,
right?
he does. It's this ongoing effort to shape public perception over time. But he also talks about dramatization, which is about creating specific events or campaigns to capture public attention and convey a particular message. Like his example of a tall office building as a symbol of progress and ambition.
It's like a visual metaphor.
Exactly. And Bernays also notes that as big business continued to grow, these public relationships became even more critical.
Because they had a bigger impact on people's lives.
Right. With increased scale came greater visibility and responsibility. And he talks about the responsibilities of businesses not only to their stockholders, but also to the wider public.
It's about being a good corporate citizen.
Exactly. And he introduces this interesting idea of inter-commodity competition, where businesses aren't just competing with others in their own industry, but against all other industries for a share of the consumer's dollar.
So it's not just Ford versus Chevy anymore.
No, it's cars versus vacations or entertainment or anything else consumers might spend their money on.
That makes it even more complex.
It does. And the Dodge Victory 6 launch with Al Jolson is a great example of the scale and methods of this kind of business propaganda.
Nationwide radio broadcasts, celebrity endorsements, it's all there.
It was a huge spectacle.
Yeah.
And he also talks about the increasing use of events like fashion shows to influence public opinion and buying habits.
Creating a buzz.
Exactly. And, of course, businesses also had to deal with negative publicity.
Right. Things don't always go as planned.
He talks about the importance of managing negative stories, using the example of a false rumor about Hudson Motor Company. And he also discusses how businesses could use local events to build positive goodwill, like the Beech Nut Packing Company honoring its president in his hometown.
So it's about being proactive and strategic in how you manage your public image.
Exactly. And Bernays' main point here seems to be that modern business had to be constantly aware of and responsive to what he called the public pulse.
Always keeping your finger on the beat of public opinion.
Precisely.
Now let's turn our attention to how Bernays saw propaganda operating in the realm of politics. What did he have to say about propaganda and political leadership?
Bernays believed that in a modern democracy, political leaders couldn't just follow public opinion. They had to lead it. He argued that the voice of the people was often shaped by the very beliefs and ideas that leaders themselves helped to create and spread.
So it's a two-way street.
Exactly. And he felt that the world of politics was lagging behind the business world in adopting these new methods of influence.
He uses the example of Emily Newell Blair's speaking tour, right?
Yes. He highlights the enormous effort and cost involved in traditional political campaigning and how inefficient it was compared to the potential of modern propaganda.
So political campaigns needed to up their game.
Absolutely. They needed to connect with voters on an emotional level, appeal to their personal interests. He uses the example of President Coolidge inviting actors to breakfast, a deliberate attempt to appeal to a specific group.
It's all about targeting your message.
Right. But he also cautioned against the use of haphazard emotional appeals, emphasizing the importance of carefully synchronizing these with the overall campaign strategy. And he noted the rising importance of personality in modern politics.
So the image of the candidate becomes more and more important.
Definitely. And he talks about the trial balloon technique, where leaders would float an idea anonymously to gauge public reaction before committing to it.
Testing the waters.
Exactly. And he even suggested that the president should have a secretary of public relations in his cabinet.
Wow. A dedicated PR person for the president.
He saw it as vital for effective communication between the government and the people.
Bridging that gap again.
Exactly. And he ultimately advocated for what he called enlightened expert propaganda in the realm of politics.
So propaganda used for good, essentially.
Yes. He believed it was necessary for effective governance in a democracy, but it had to be done in an informed and responsible way.
Let's move on to women's activities and propaganda. How did Bernays see women using these techniques?
Bernays recognized that organized women in America were wielding significant influence through the strategic use of propaganda. He highlighted the work of groups like the Legislative Committee of 14 Women's Organizations and their successes in pushing for legislation like the 8-Hour Workday for Women and the Shepherd-Towner Act.
So they were effective organizers.
Very much so. And they used a wide range of methods, distributing literature, publishing bulletins, organizing demonstrations. He gives the example of the Consumers Committee of Women fighting the American valuation tariff with public protests.
Taking their message to the streets.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about politics. Women's clubs were also involved in issues like health education, the arts, and social welfare. Their influence was widespread.
Now, what about propaganda for education? Did Bernays feel that the education world was effectively using these tools?
Actually, he argued that the field of education was lagging behind. Despite the importance of education in a democracy, he saw a lack of public interest and understanding, and he felt that educators needed to use propaganda themselves to build support for their work.
So they needed to promote themselves better.
Exactly. He highlighted the financial challenges faced by universities and the need for public support. And he discussed this tension between scholarly research and making knowledge accessible to the wider public.
The ivory tower versus the real world.
Yes, he used the example of a Harvard professor whose important research went largely unnoticed by the public.
That's unfortunate.
It is. And Bernays noted that universities were starting to recognize the importance of public relations, with the rise of news bureaus and things like that. He cited examples like Cornell assisting with the census, showing how universities could engage with public issues.
Oh, it's about connecting with the community.
Right, and showing the value of what they do.
Moving on to propaganda and social service. How did Bernays connect these two seemingly disparate fields?
Bernays argued that social service organizations, because they relied on voluntary support, were inherently involved in propaganda. They had to persuade the public to support their causes, and he highlighted the difficulty of overcoming public apathy when it came to social reform.
People can be resistant to change.
Exactly. He uses the example of the campaign against lynching, showing how they used conferences, media engagement, and influential figures to shift public opinion. And he mentions other campaigns for dental hygiene, better parks, tuberculosis prevention, things like that.
All worthy causes.
Definitely. And he quotes Professor Harry Elmer Barnes, who said that progress in penology depended on what he called scientific publicity, which is essentially propaganda used to educate the public.
So even in areas like criminal justice reform, public perception is key.
Absolutely.
Now, what about art and science? How did Bernays see propaganda playing a role in those fields?
Bernays believed that propaganda was essential for shaping public appreciation of art. He felt that artists needed to connect with the public and that public taste often had to be deliberately cultivated. He highlighted the growing collaboration between art and industry, with businesses using art to enhance their products.
Like that Paris Silk exhibition he mentions, with American industrial art.
Yes, that's a great example. And he talks about Secretary Hoover's involvement in the Paris exposition, showing how the government was using art to promote American industry. And he discussed the role of museums in educating public taste, arguing that they needed to be more proactive in their outreach.
So museums shouldn't just be stuffy repositories of art. They need to engage with people.
Exactly. And in the realm of science and technology, Bernays pointed to companies like the telephone and electric companies using propaganda to make their innovations understandable and accepted by the public.
Demystifying new technologies.
Right.
Finally, let's touch on what Bernays called the mechanics of propaganda. What were some of the key tools and approaches he identified?
Bernays emphasized that the tools of propaganda were constantly evolving. He traced this shift from public meetings to newspapers, the impact of the automobile, and the rise of radio. And he talked about how newspapers were adapting to the emergence of radio.
The media landscape was changing rapidly, even back then.
It was, and Bernays stressed the ongoing importance of personality in propaganda. He said there were countless ways to reach the public mind, from schools to the new medium of television.
So many different channels.
Yes. And he ended on a rather optimistic note, suggesting that the intelligent use of propaganda was necessary for bringing order out of the chaos of conflicting opinions in a democracy.
So to sum up our deep dive into Bernays' propaganda, it seems clear that he saw it as a fundamental and pervasive force in society. He argued for its necessity, its evolution into a more sophisticated form, and its application across all aspects of life.
Absolutely. And while his ideas were formed nearly a century ago, they offer a fascinating and maybe even a little unsettling perspective on how public opinion is shaped even today.
Which brings us to our final thought for you, our listener. Considering Bernays' observations about these invisible governors and the subtle ways in which our opinions can be influenced, how do his ideas resonate with the way information and influence operate in our current digital age? What would Bernays make of social media algorithms, targeted advertising, the constant flow of information we face every day? What are the modern-day equivalents of the methods he described, and what new challenges and opportunities do they present for individuals trying to understand and navigate the forces shaping their world?
It's something to think about, isn't it?
It is. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. See you next time.
See you then.